Hello, my name is Jessica Wilkinson and I will be presenting my case study today, which I did over my 4-week prac. The student that I am going to be talking about I will call Thomas for the sake of this case study. He was a 16-year-old student in my Year 11 Modern History class and he was diagnosed with Asperger's disorder. So he was high functioning, but his diagnosis was actually quite mild, which meant he didn't have access to a lot of the learning support that other students with a stronger diagnosis would have. On top of that, he also rejected a lot of the supports that were put in place before I arrived because he didn't want to be made to feel different in any way. So everything that I put in place for him had to be quite subtle. He was very diligent, very enthusiastic in history, so he was quite easy to work with in that respect. He was also very factual, very concrete in his thinking. So my task was to extend him in that area. So over the 4 weeks, I used a data tracking tool in order to keep track of what type of data I collected and when I collected it, and each week had a different focus. So in my first week, I wanted to observe him, engage in professional discussions with learning support and my mentor, and also discussions with him and observe him to see what were his key issues. A number were identified, but I picked 4 that were relevant for modern history, the context that I was actually teaching him in. The first key issue that I recognised was his academic achievement was quite low, so he's sitting just in the C range, starting to go into a C+. He's a lot lower than most of his other students in his class, although he's also passing strongly. I was told these assessment tasks were actually written assignments, and so my mentor said the task I was preparing him for was an exam. So given the pressure of those conditions, I had to consider he may not achieve as highly in that exam. So I had to put supports in place to help him do his best in that situation. I also noticed that he struggled with assignment work to show evaluation and analysis, so those higher order thinking skills. His communication, so sentence structure and grammar, was also lacking, and he also struggled to see the individual steps he needed to take in order to achieve the end result. So if I gave an activity in class, what does he need to do to succeed in that activity? All of these issues were process related, not content related. So that was my key focus. I was differentiating process. So I did some research into how to support learners like him with Asperger's disorder, and given the factual, very concrete nature that he displayed, which is typical, the suggestion of graphic organisers was given. So I took that on board and I partnered it with tiered questioning, so moving from lower order to higher order thinking questions. So for example, a PCQ chart, at the top I put some tiered questions in each column, which would then scaffold his thinking to hopefully extend his thoughts from that concrete to the more abstract way that he needs to be. And that is the biggest part of the history criteria, is actually his analysis and evaluation, so that's why I focused on that. For example, with a 6 C's analysis, which they had to do in class, I gave him a graphic organiser that used questions within each of those 6 C's that were tiered, which then structured how he actually had to write his responses as well. And then the final initial strategy that I used was for inquiry activities, which were more abstract in nature. I gave him a process, so each step that he needed to complete in that inquiry activity to get him to the finished product. And after looking at his ISP, they suggested the use of process words and highlighting. So I started each step with a process word and highlighted it, so he knew specifically what he had to do in each stage. So this was week 2 of my prac, which was basically the implementation of initial strategies. I then sought his feedback to see how he was responding through the use of exit cards, and these 2 stood out to me because he's actually quite consistently talked about the process, not the content. So here he said he's struggling with his 6 C's analysis, and here he's struggling to recall information right after it's been presented. So that might be a video or a source. So I took that on board in my 3rd week when I was reviewing my strategies and seeing how could I improve them, and I did some research and discovered this idea of pre-teaching, so flipping the classroom, providing extra processing time. So I achieved this through emailing him his work before every lesson, gave him all the materials that he needed, and he then had the opportunity to engage with that before coming to class. And then I also worked on my graphic organisers a little bit more and tried to scaffold every single activity. So for example, if there was a video, I gave him specific times in the video that he had to look at. Or if there was a source, I then worked on, especially with visual sources, giving him some questions that helped him to elicit this information that's often not obvious through visual sources. And then for written sources, it's hard to see because it's black and white. If you hold it closer, I've actually highlighted the parts of the source he needs to specifically focus on. So, and then again, use the tiered questioning in each of those. I also decided that through my research, it was good to give him a goal that he was working towards, since students generally perform better when they know what they're aiming towards. So I actually did an exemplar for him of a 6Cs analysis that was at an A level, and he had this alongside him every time he had to do a source analysis. All of this was partnered with prompting, so verbal prompts and cues, and one-on-one time in class. So I always made sure I went to him first, because I looked into positive niche construction, which is very strength-based, and I noticed through observations he articulates himself very well. So I gave him as much opportunity in class to talk to me as he possibly could, and then helped him to transfer that into his written work. So then, after implementing these adjusted strategies, I then saw his feedback again, which he's told me that he actually has enjoyed all of the strategies I've implemented, but the one-on-one time in class is really what he's depended upon, and that there was nothing more that he wanted me to change or to do. He was happy with what I was implementing. I, however, wanted to move on from the evaluation and into his written communication. So I developed an editing checklist with him, which he had to use every time he completed a piece of work, and then as we got into his essay structure, I then broke that down, so paragraph structure, and went through that with him as well, so that it guided his written work. In my 4th week, I wanted to evaluate where is he overall, so I got some more source analysis activities from him, and noticed that his answers are still quite, they lack depth. However, the ones that have more depth are actually the result of one-on-one conversations. So when I talked with him and elicited that, he was then able to write it. So he really depended on that strategy. I also noticed him getting more confidence in class, so he was actually putting his hand up, contributing to class discussions, which he had not done beforehand. And he was also actually deciding to write paragraphs in activities where I hadn't even asked him to do that. So he was receiving confidence in that area. So this paragraph, he says, my reasoning is that. So he's actually justifying what he's written in the activity I gave him. Now this paragraph needs work, but he's actually his zone of proximal development has changed, and so I then started to try and work with him in the paragraph area more, noticing he's actually trying to use analysis evaluation skills and justification skills, which was fantastic to see. And then to basically bookend all of this, I got his exam results to see, okay, how has he come through at the end. Unfortunately, he's now sitting on a C-, and when looking at his exam, his factual knowledge is fantastic, but he lacked the analysis and the evaluation, and there was some sentence structure issues, but a lot of the history criteria was dependent on his analysis and evaluation skills. So the conclusion that I've reached is that he connected well with the strategies that I implemented, which is evident through the feedback he was giving me. He's actually attempted to use analysis and evaluation skills, and extended that into paragraph written work even when that was not actually required of him. He's also responded well to the tiered questioning, which I also used in my one-on-one prompting. And unfortunately, he still needs to work on his written work in terms of his communication, so grammar, punctuation and syntax. He also needs to work on his depth of analysis of the different sources that he's engaging with in order to actually raise that grade. So my key recommendation for my mentor and for any teacher that would continue working with Thomas would be to use the graphic organisers, since it actually structures how he writes his answers, but to refine them. So basically, what would be good is if I had more than 4 weeks with him, which any other teacher working with him would have more than 4 weeks. So basically continue to refine those graphic organisers, refine the tiered questioning in order to elicit that higher order thinking, even explore him representing his learning in different ways. So that would be through illustrations, through drawing, just to see is there a strength in that area that I didn't previously discover. Where that would be difficult is then linking that in with the history curriculum, which is quite linguistic based, but that would be a great way for him to represent his learning in class. I think as well, to actually test him, I've provided him with a lot of resources, but to actually see, can he create his own graphic organisers? Could he recall what the 6 C's are? Can he recall how to write a paragraphs? And so now I'm testing his higher order thinking. Has he gone from just receiving to now actually explaining, being able to teach me what he needs to do? And then, of course, to continue with the verbal prompting, the one-on-one, which is his strength in terms of his articulation. So yeah, that is the journey that I went on with my student, and I'm excited to see where he goes from here.
Thank you.
Well done, Jess.
Excellent, Jess. So
and I get to
Can
see
I
him because I'm doing my internship there.
Oh.
So I
Nice.
get to work with him for another 6 weeks, which is good.
now we might just turn this off
You have a
unless
question?
you want questions put. I think we'll turn it off if